Welcome to Twists of Life, where every story has an unexpected turn. Stories of joy and sorrow, hope and redemption, just like the life we all live. Make yourself comfortable. It's time to begin. In a small room wallpapered with faded floral print, there were two people, a short woman with streaks of gray in her hair and a face that looked carved from stone. She had a predatory aquiline nose and lips pressed into a thin line. A coarse, heavy necklace on her chest bounced with every movement as she opened her mouth, spewing words sharp as a razor and stinging as a whip crack. "Dave, do you not grasp that life as it was has become unbearable for us?" the woman asked, raising her head. "Her presence weighs us down." The man looked at his mother with a mixture of filial defiance and a crushing sense of guilt. The soft features of his face had become utterly sorrowful. His hands hung limply by his sides, and his gaze wandered everywhere, avoiding meeting his mother's eyes. "She's my wife, Mother. How can you not understand?" The woman threw up her hands in indignation, letting out a short, contemptuous sound. "Oh, don't give me that wife nonsense. You wouldn't have strayed if she meant anything to you, and I have no intention of dragging out an existence waiting on her. She's become like a vegetable, and you heard what the doctor said? She won't last a year. What's the point of doing anything at all? I suppose she'll be perfectly fine at her grandmother's house. She can remember her homeland and childhood." David shook his head vaguely, as if trying to shake off a delusion. "Besides, there will be a decent inheritance from her after she passes. That can fix our dire situation. So—" David looked at his mother thoughtfully and sighed heavily. The next day, all the bags and suitcases containing the belongings of Eleanor, David's wife, were packed. Patricia Smith, the girl's mother-in-law, put them out in the hallway, smirking at the sight of her bewildered daughter-in-law. Eleanor was a miniature, fragile girl with fair hair, condemned to a wheelchair. At 27, she was suddenly struck down by a stroke, turning her into an invalid. Eleanor lost not only the ability to move but also to speak. She sat almost constantly in her wheelchair, immersed in silence. Patricia Smith looked after her daughter-in-law, while David was tied up at work at the insurance firm. At times, Eleanor felt that her husband deliberately stayed late at the office, just to avoid returning to a helpless wife who couldn't even manage the simplest needs on her own. It must be admitted that Patricia Smith had never felt any particular affection for her daughter-in-law. She disliked Eleanor's ambitions and her passionate desire to achieve a lot. The mother-in-law believed that a girl should be a support to her husband, not rush around all day on company business where she worked. Eleanor held the position of assistant to the general director of a large company. With time, the girl dreamed of promotion and a permanent position. Ideally, she dreamt of her own business. However, she had neither the means nor suitable opportunities for this yet. The stroke destroyed any remaining remnants of sympathy Patricia Smith had for her daughter-in-law. If before she merely tormented the girl with her nagging, after the incident, she constantly lashed out at her with shouts. She couldn't bear Eleanor's silent pleas, and often forgot about medicine or lunch. Only one thing pleased her. Eleanor couldn't speak, and didn't interrupt the woman as she reread the plays in which she had once shown on the theater stage. While David dragged the heavy suitcases to the car, Eleanor sat opposite the door, watching the events with silent horror. Her eyes were red, and she could barely hold back her sobs. "Don't worry," Patricia Smith smirked. "Your doctor said your heart is weak. You won't last long. And the air in the village is healing. Maybe you'll even live out this year. A little house in the village. Haven't you ever dreamt of going back there?" Countless thoughts whirled in Eleanor's head, but not a single one could break free. Her hands lay limply on her lap. If only she could, she would have clutched at the fabric of the sweatpants, squeezing it in her fist, and then burst into a scream. telling her mother-in-law everything she thought about this old gray witch. "Davy, darling, what's taking you so long?" The breathless man came up the stairs, breathing heavily. It was clear the climb had been difficult for him. He looked at his mother, holding out a hand. "The elevator's broken down there. I had to drag all this from the 20th floor." Patricia Smith threw up her hands and shook her head, giving her daughter-in-law a reproachful look. "And I kept saying you should have hired movers." "Mother, you know perfectly well we don't have the money for that. Once I played in theaters every day, filling auditoriums, and Bobby would come after lectures to see me," the woman said dreamily. "Could I have imagined then that I'd have to clean up diapers?" Patricia Smith looked at her daughter-in-law again and fell silent. Their neighbor, Vera, walked along the landing. "Good day," the neighbor nodded. "Going somewhere?" Patricia Smith broke into a wide smile. "Vera, hello? Yes, we're taking Ellie to a nursing home for rehabilitation. The doctor assured us it should help." "That must be quite expensive," Vera shook her head. "Oh yes, ruinously expensive, but we'll have to tighten our belts," Patricia Smith sighed. "We can't leave our daughter-in-law without treatment. After all, she's done so much for us." Vera said something else and headed into her apartment. The smile and pitiful expression instantly vanished from Patricia Smith's face. She turned to her son, frowning. "Hurry up before the whole building knows about our plans. I told you we should have done this first thing this morning." David picked up a suitcase, snorting. "Morning? It's freezing cold. It's autumn. Do you want me to freeze off all my limbs?" the man asked, and without waiting for an answer, left the apartment, leaving his indignant mother behind. David was the only and adored child in the family. Patricia Smith and Professor Robert Smith had him late in life and doted on him. The law university professor and the drama theater star put their affairs on the back burner, dedicating themselves to raising their son. The result of such hyper-parenting was a frail David, who at almost 40 still lived with his mother and held a low-paying job where his boss mocked him and colleagues disliked him. Almost 40 minutes later, David finished moving all the things and Eleanor herself. He settled the girl in the back seat, folding her wheelchair. Tears streamed from the girl's eyes, and she was breathing heavily. Her gaze, full of confusion and a touch of hope, was fixed on her husband. "Ellie, calm down, please," the man whispered softly, adjusting the seatbelt. "Brenda, a neighbor, will look after you there. We'll pay her with your money." "Of course," Patricia Smith intervened. David shrugged and nodded. "We're, not doing great with finances right now. So yes, it'll be from yours. You'll be better off there." Eleanor watched her husband with an unblinking gaze, trying to discern in his pale face at least a hint of pity for her or reluctance to do what he was doing. But there was nothing of the sort, only constant glances around for strangers who might see a crying girl and a man carrying her to a car. David and Eleanor's car drove away from the house exactly at noon. Patricia Smith waved and went home to immerse herself again in the well-worn book of plays, imagining herself on stage, greeted by the ovations of admiring art connoisseurs. David sighed, increasing speed. He tried not to look in the rear-view mirror, where the girl's swollen eyes were reflected, sitting silently behind him. "Ellie, you do understand I have no other choice, don't you?" The man could have sworn the girl raised an eyebrow mockingly. However, after wiping his glasses, he saw only his wife's stony face. "My mother is trying to make things better for us. She's right. I can't look after you constantly. I have work. She's not young anymore, so you'll be better off there. You'll have your own caretaker. You'll return to your grandmother's house, which you often remembered fondly. So?" David fell silent again, turning away from his wife's gaze. However, he felt it on his back, It seemed to burn through his thin jacket, pressing directly onto his lungs, making him breathe faster. The journey to the village where Eleanor was to live was long. The village was remote and almost God-forsaken. It had only a couple of streets with a small number of houses, one small shop in the center, and an old first aid post that had been closed for several years due to lack of staff. The dark blue car rattled to a halt near a small house with a garden gone wild from neglect and a crooked fence. The house itself, however, looked quite decent, at least from the outside. The garden was full of old trees and thick grass, in places reaching the height of the fence. In front of the window stood an old bench on two small stumps, on which someone was lying. While David was getting his wife out of the car, unfolding her wheelchair and belongings, Eleanor stared unblinkingly at the silhouette lying near the house of her long-deceased grandmother. The girl squinted but couldn't figure out who it was. "Brenda!" David shouted. A short woman with short hair grumbled as she got up from the bench. The woman staggered towards the gate. Her face was wrinkled and sagging, her hair tangled. A large crack gaped on her lip, and an old bruise adorned her eye. Brenda was dressed in completely mismatched clothes: a yellow t-shirt with some English writing, short green trousers completely unsuitable for the weather, and worn pink shoes with rhinestones. "Mr. Smith," the woman exclaimed. "You're early," Brenda said, stuttering. David frowned and turned to his wife. "This is your caretaker, Ellie. Meet her. Her name is Brenda. She'll look after you now." In confirmation of his words, Brenda nodded and swayed. If Eleanor could have, she would certainly have rolled her eyes. The situation seemed monstrously absurd and terrifyingly awful to her. David unloaded all the suitcases from the car, even carried them into the house, and handed Brenda a thin envelope. There was clearly not much in it, but judging by her appearance, it was enough for her. Then the man stopped in front of the wheelchair and sighed. "Ellie, why are you so unhappy? I'm sure you're smiling inside. It's your childhood home." The man surveyed the overgrown area, the gate that fell apart in his hands, the fresh air, constant care. What more could anyone need for happiness? Eleanor wanted to list a million things that would make her happy. However, as usual, she remained silent, looking at her husband with anger. Each of her glances carried more thoughts than anyone could express in words. David understood this, and a small worm of conscience even stirred within him. But then his mother's words and the numbers on the card surfaced in his mind, and the worm fell silent, anticipating the taste of money. David got into the car and waved to his wife through the window. Brenda approached her charge, waving to the man. "Don't worry, Mr. Smith. Everything will be fine." The man forced another strained smile, and the car drove away from the ill-fated house, leaving Eleanor alone with the empty, overgrown house and an alcoholic who reeked not only of drink, but of everything else one could find in the village. A year later. "Dave, have you seriously not checked on your wife once in—" Patricia Smith looked at the calendar. "In a year?" she said with horror. "Are you completely insane, Dave? And who raised you like this? How do you know she hasn't died long ago, or worse, gotten out of her wheelchair?" David tore his gaze away from the television, looking tiredly at the match. He had just returned from work and had accidentally mentioned that he hadn't visited his wife once. Patricia Smith was shocked and indignant. "Brenda calls me weekly. Everything is fine there. I take her money quarterly. Calm down." Patricia Smith snorted, walked over to the sofa where her son was lounging, snatched the remote, and turned off the cursed box. "When I'm talking to you, you should only look at me," the woman said loudly and with some theatricality, shaking her head with its elaborate high hairstyle. "Brenda? Who is that anyway? That same alcoholic you left to look after your wife? Are you even sure she's looking after her and not drinking away the money I give her?" Maybe she hasn't been to see Eleanor in ages while you're lying here staring at the television. David felt sick. He rolled his eyes, staring blankly at the wall. Do you want me to go see her tomorrow? Fine. I'll sacrifice my only day off for a trip to a remote village to see my half-dead wife. Yes, Mother. You're very caring towards me. Snorting loudly, Patricia Smith threw the television remote at her son and left the room, quietly muttering everything she thought about him. The next morning, David packed a few things, took an envelope with money, and got into the car. He looked wistfully at the clock face, which showed only 8 in the morning. The man could still be sleeping, but instead, he had to drive God knows where, and most importantly, God knows why. He considered his mother's fears groundless. However, he had been accustomed to obeying her in everything, always, since childhood. The journey was long, and as luck would have it, the radio broke down. The silence in the car and the rare exclamations of impatient drivers made the morning even worse. Just as he was approaching the village, a large black truck with a flatbed flew towards the man. It was speeding, clearly knowing the area. A man who looked several years younger than David was driving. He braked sharply at the sight of the slow-moving city car and quietly apologized, saying he didn't mean to. David waved a tired hand, not wanting to get into an argument. The road to the house where Eleanor lived was vaguely remembered by the man. He used to give the money to Brenda in the district center, where she would come by bus specifically for the envelope. In the village itself, David had only been 3 times. Once when he took his wife there, the second time when he was looking for Brenda, and the third time when he was still dating Eleanor, and she showed him her childhood home, saying that first her mother had spent her childhood there, and then she herself. The dark blue car stopped next to an almost new fence. The grass in the garden was mown, but it had already grown quite long, as if it had been done a long time ago, and overall the area looked neglected, as if no one had been there for a long time. David frowned and got out of the car. He carefully opened the gate and called out to his wife, then to Brenda. Silence. No one answered. The man wanted to enter the house, but a huge padlock hung on the door, blocking the way. David tugged at the door, but it didn't budge. He took out his phone and started calling Brenda, but she didn't answer. The man tiredly rubbed his forehead and looked around the area. Brenda's house should have been nearby. He found it very close to Eleanor's house. At the time, it seemed like great luck, but now his mother's suspicions didn't seem so foolish. Brenda didn't inspire confidence. However, for some reason, David still trusted her. Leaving the grounds of the little house, the man walked along the street to find Brenda's house. It looked even worse than Eleanor's house. David entered it and held his nose. An unpleasant smell hit his nostrils. It was so strong that David only had the strength to quickly look around the house. Brenda wasn't there, and he hurried outside, breathing deeply of the fresh air. Having caught his breath, he raised his head and saw a plump woman walking by with 2 buckets. "David!" he shouted and ran towards her. "Excuse me, do you know where Eleanor is?" The woman frowned. "She lived in that house," David pointed. "And Brenda? Bren? The alcoholic who was looking after the house?" David nodded affirmatively. "Well, then she's probably at Sam's place. He lives at the end of the village. She buys moonshine from him. And who might you be?" "It doesn't matter," David waved it off. "Point me to Sam's house." "And why wouldn't I?" The woman pointed the way to the local moonshiner's house. Brenda was indeed inside. She was sitting at a huge round table, drinking a yellow liquid that gave off a pungent aroma in all directions. David grabbed Brenda by the arms and led her outside. "Where's Eleanor? Who's being cheeky?" Brenda asked loudly, her tongue thick. She seemed to be looking straight ahead, seeing nothing. "My wife, where is she, you drunken alcoholic?" She lives nearby, Brenda smirked, raising a disobedient hand. And what's in it for me? David angrily pulled out his wallet, took out several banknotes, and shoved them at Brenda. She counted the money with a businesslike air and nodded contentedly. Then she slipped out of the man's strong grip and stumbled back into Sam's house. She came out without the money but with a large bottle of cloudy yellow liquid. Let's go. The woman waved a hand and hobbled forward, trying not to fall. David followed her. The woman led him outside the street. They walked for a long time on a deserted road. It seemed to the man that Brenda had decided to confuse him, and he was about to yell at her, but in the distance, the roof of an unknown house appeared. The closer David and Brenda got to it, the more he was struck by the size of the building compared to the others in the village. It seemed simply enormous. 3 floors, a balcony, an extensive garden in the backyard. Several cars and agricultural machinery were visible. Brenda stopped near the iron gates of the house and pointed straight ahead. Here you go, sign for it. She nodded so hard her head almost came off, and walked away, saying nothing more. David was in shock at what he saw, so he didn't reply to the woman's phrase. He rang a small bell. A clear, joyful voice rang out. Nick, why are you so early? David was taken aback, freezing in place for a second. Eleanor? He asked softly. The voice on the other side fell silent, then a deep sigh was heard. Dave, come in. The door swung open, revealing a huge garden and a stone path lined with countless flowers blooming profusely. Stepping carefully along the path, David went inside. On the steps of the house stood a short, miniature girl with fair hair. She was dressed in a beige suit and a shawl. From top to bottom, she looked at her husband. Her face was almost inscrutable, as if a mask was frozen on it. I thought you weren't going to show up, the girl smirked, but come in, since you're here. David was speechless. He simply followed his wife slowly as she walked confidently through the house. Inside, the house was furnished very simply but tastefully. Pleasant colors, beautiful decorations and paintings, soft, clean carpets. One of the doors led to a small study with a computer and a desk piled high with papers. Oh, don't look in there. We've had a complete mess with papers lately. Need to sort it out better. David didn't understand anything but shifted his gaze to his wife, who looked even better than before the stroke. Her pale face was covered with a healthy blush. Her scarlet lips shone with gloss, and her eyes were lightly made up. Nothing excessive, but it seemed David had never seen such beauty. Eleanor led the man into a large room with sofas and armchairs. I'll make some tea and we'll talk. Eleanor went to the kitchen for tea, leaving David alone in the room. He sat down in an armchair, unable to tear his eyes away from the splendor of the room. Paintings, sofas, flowers, carpets. It all seemed unreal. The man even pinched himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. He couldn't believe he had expected to see a sick wife in a wheelchair, and instead, a beauty he had never seen in his life stood before him. Eleanor returned a couple of minutes later with a large tray holding several cups of tea. She handed 1 cup to her husband and took the second herself, sitting down neatly opposite him. Didn't expect this? She asked softly. The man shook his head. I didn't expect my beloved husband to send me away to die for money either. I thought... Keep your meaningless excuses to yourself, Eleanor asked him. I know everything about you, dear. You're too bad at hiding the truth. It's all about my inheritance. When I received the will from my grandmother in Germany, I was immensely happy, imagining the life we would have together now. But then I saw something that made me change my mind. What? David asked, stuttering. He held the hot cup of tea in his hands, as if not noticing the pain, and looked directly at his wife's face, hoping to see something there that would help him understand what was happening. "Do you remember my friend?" Eleanor asked. "Vicky? We worked together at the firm." David nodded. "She was the one who advised me to change my life a year and a half ago." Tall, stately Victoria sat in an armchair in a small restaurant where their boss had sent them for negotiations that had already concluded. "Dinner's paid for. Why not splurge?" Eleanor smirked, settling comfortably opposite Victoria. Victoria was Eleanor's colleague. She worked at the firm with Eleanor, was several years older than her, and held the position of head of the department. She always wore strict suits and had a very definite opinion on many matters, especially concerning finances. Eleanor opened a small women's handbag, took out an envelope, and handed it to her friend. "Look, what do you think? Is it real?" Victoria opened the envelope with interest and read the letter. It was a letter from Germany. "Who is Anna Richter?" "My grandmother," Eleanor replied, "on my father's side. She married a German when my father was 6 or 7, and they went to live there. Then my father returned to Russia and met my mother. The last time I saw my grandmother was at my father's funeral. She offered to take me with her." "And why didn't you agree?" Victoria asked in surprise. "Was I supposed to abandon Dave? He has his mother here, his work, and I never dreamt of going abroad." Victoria looked at her colleague with incomprehension. "You're incorrigible, Ellie, trading a good life in Germany for a man." Eleanor rolled her eyes. She knew her friend's opinion of her husband perfectly well and preferred not to listen to it. Victoria was always very sharp in her statements, which helped her career, but meant she had few friends. They all scattered from her directness. "Your Dave would be ready to sell his own mother for money. Do you even know how much your grandmother left you?" "There was a letter attached," Eleanor replied. "She wrote that I was her last relative, and she was leaving part of the inheritance to her husband's children and part to me. Judging by the letter, it's a very decent sum, as well as a small share in an estate in Germany." "Do you have to go there to get it?" Victoria asked. "There are instructions on what to do. You can accept the inheritance in Russia. The notary will come here himself." A waiter approached, bringing their food. The girls ordered salads and a glass of wine each. "I can imagine how happy Dave will be. He always dreamt of money, of his own business." "You dreamt of it too," Victoria noted, gesturing with her fork. "And unlike him, you have the opportunity to run it." "Don't talk about Dave like that. He's a good person. He's just unlucky." Victoria laughed loudly. "Yes, and most of all, he was unlucky with his mother. Not a mother-in-law, but I still don't understand why you live with her when you could move out." Eleanor shrugged. "Patricia Smith can't live alone. She's not used to it, and it's not that hard for me to tolerate her." Victoria snorted disapprovingly and sipped her wine. "I wouldn't advise telling them about the inheritance. They'll either send you to the next world for that money or start fawning over you and take every last penny." Eleanor slammed her palm on the table and looked at her friend threateningly. "Dave and I love each other. Nothing like that will happen. Don't stir things up. You have too low an opinion of my family." "Really?" The conversation ended in nothing. That same evening, Eleanor returned home, told her family about the inheritance, and showed them the envelope. The girl had never seen them so happy. That evening, Patricia Smith uncorked a bottle of expensive wine, and despite their constant economizing, she ordered food delivery for David to celebrate. Eleanor felt that her life was starting to get better. A few weeks later, Eleanor was walking down the street, smiling at everything around her. Life at home had improved. Patricia Smith stopped nagging her. David started coming home earlier from work and spending more time with his wife. Eleanor was sure that her life had improved and would now always be this way. The girl decided to stop by a men's clothing store. She wanted to buy her husband a gift, a new tie. He was tired of all his old ones. Eleanor was captivated by the display window, noticing nothing around her. Then she turned her head and saw David. She wanted to call out to him, but then she noticed a girl walking towards him. The man hugged her and kissed her. Struck unexpectedly in the gut, Eleanor stumbled and leaned on the display window to keep her balance. She couldn't believe what she saw. Eleanor didn't make a scene. She simply went home and went to bed early, thinking about what had happened before falling asleep. The next morning, the girl took a day off work and went to a local detective agency. A short, thin man in glasses sat at a small table. He was reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. Eleanor sat opposite him and explained the situation. "What exactly do you need?" "Everything," Eleanor said. "How did they meet? How long have they been seeing each other? Their words, actions, meeting places. I want to know everything." The man whistled but said nothing. He seemed surprised by the girl's eagerness. However, he chose to remain silent so as not to lose a client. For a whole week, Eleanor was in limbo. She didn't dare tell Victoria the truth, not wanting to hear her say, "I told you so." But she had to admit, Victoria was indeed right. She seemed to always see right through David, disapproving of their relationship. She refused to be a witness at their wedding, which deeply hurt Eleanor. They made up soon after, but the lingering resentment remained in the girl's heart. Only now did she begin to understand her friend, who had only wanted to reach her. A week later, Eleanor sat alone in a small coffee shop, sipping her now cold coffee. She was pondering what was happening. Everything in her head just wouldn't fit together into a single picture. The girl had always tried for her husband, doing everything he or his mother asked. She had even swallowed her own pride, curbing her ambitions. The girl's thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. The detective asked her to come in. Throwing a banknote on the table, Eleanor grabbed her bag and rushed to the agency. Fortunately, it was nearby. She flew inside and sat opposite the man, who, as before, was reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. He raised his head at the client and adjusted his sliding glasses. "You know, you're lucky your husband's mistress turned out to be so talkative." "Really?" Eleanor asked, not wanting to hear the answer to her question. But the man nodded anyway. "I had to follow her for almost a week, interview her friends, but I found out everything. Her name is Lily. She's 22, a graduate of a pedagogical university. They met your husband a few months ago on the street, I think." "Thank you for the information. What about any facts like video or—" The detective, smiling broadly, reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a huge, old-fashioned dictaphone. Eleanor was truly surprised by what she saw. She hadn't seen such devices since childhood. It seemed they weren't made anymore. After fiddling with something, the man turned on a loud, sometimes crackling recording. "Davy," a clear female voice exclaimed. "Is this for me? Oh my gods, how beautiful. Expensive, I bet?" "I spare no expense for you," David's satisfied voice said. "Once I open my business, I can spoil you with trinkets every day." "And when—" "Davy?" the girl asked again. "You said you don't have money for your business yet?" There were no sounds, but Eleanor could have sworn David smiled broadly. "My wife does. She recently got an inheritance from her grandmother. We'll open a business with her money and live well." "You'll leave her, right?" Lily said, as if through pouting lips. "As soon as she's no longer useful to me." "Yes," David said loudly. And the recording continued. The man and the girl talked about something. However, Eleanor was no longer listening to them. She was lost in her thoughts, sitting with a perfectly straight back and staring straight ahead. She remembered meeting her husband and how happy she was when he proposed. Eleanor was 11 years younger than David. They met when she was finishing her economics degree. He invited her to cozy cafes, walked with her in the park under the stars, bought tickets to the theater and concerts. Patricia Smith seemed very sweet and kind then. Eleanor, who had recently lost her mother, fell in love with the intellectual family and was ready to marry the not-so-rich and shy David. Victoria was against it, but Eleanor didn't listen. She was consumed by new feelings. Memories surfaced in the girl's mind of choosing a wedding suit with Dave and of sorting through gifts after the ceremony, counting which relative gave more. The girl was immensely happy then. She was sure she would always be this happy. Despite the fact that David wasn't at all happy about her dreams of business and career, he, and more so his mother, wanted a family and children. The girl wasn't ready for that. She wanted more. Now all her dreams and hopes for a life together had crumbled in an instant. Dave, the very Dave who had never raised his voice to his wife, was contemplating how he would use Eleanor's money to open a business and leave her. It seemed so wild that the girl sat there, staring blankly at the wall, for several minutes. The detective didn't interfere. He had seen worse reactions. This was the most normal. Once one crazy wife simply smashed his window in a fit of rage at her husband. At the time, it seemed wild, the ultimate measure of disappointment and anger. But now he looked into the girl's eyes and saw all-consuming hatred and pain that even affected him. The man got up and went to get water to bring to his client. Eleanor drank the water in one gulp, and then she remembered her friend's words about David being willing to sell his own mother for money. The girl hadn't believed Victoria then, but now it seemed true. A malicious grin began to form on the girl's intelligent face, and the detective recoiled. He had never seen such an expression. A few months later, David's dark blue car drove away from the crooked fence, behind which Eleanor remained. Her wheelchair was held by Brenda. In fact, she was more holding onto the wheelchair than holding it. As soon as the car disappeared from sight, Eleanor stood up. Brenda's eyes widened as she stared at her charge, who had simply gotten up from her wheelchair after a stroke. "Brenda, let's make a deal. I'll pay you the same amount my husband pays you, and you won't tell him what you saw." Brenda nodded, dumbfounded, unable to ask questions. She was still holding on to the wheelchair. "Excellent. We'll get along perfectly. Here's your first payment." Eleanor held out several banknotes. "You'll come every month, and I'll give you money. In return, you must tell my husband that my condition hasn't changed, and he doesn't need to visit. Clear?" The woman nodded, snatched the banknote, and without saying goodbye, walked away, while Eleanor went into the house to change. Inside the old house, everything was covered in dust. The furniture was draped with cloth, and trash lay everywhere. One window was even broken. Children must have tried to climb in. Eleanor walked over to an old red sofa, pulled the cloth off it, and tiredly sank onto a chair. A cloud of dust rose around her. The girl took out her phone, which Patricia Smith had miraculously not found, and dialed the only number she could trust. "Come, everything happened just as you said. Yes, the house in the village. I'm waiting." Throwing the phone aside, Eleanor lay down. Her head was buzzing with thoughts. She thought about everything and nothing at the same time. An hour and a half later, when Eleanor had cleaned the house, changed, and prepared food, the door opened, and a tall girl in a strict blue suit entered. She had a small bag in her hands, wine and takeout food. "Scrambled eggs don't appeal to me," Victoria smirked, nodding at the old dirty frying pan covered with such a thick layer of grease that washing it off was probably impossible. "Good thing you brought wine. I definitely wouldn't have survived this day without it." Victoria looked around the little house and nodded to herself. Then her gaze fell on a package of diapers, and she shook her head. You sat in this. Oh my God, this is utterly disgusting. Yes, I can't disagree. But do you know what bothered me more? Eleanor asked, taking dishes out of the cupboards. What? Victoria was wiping the table and arranging the food containers. Patricia Smith only changed my diaper once a day. It seemed she didn't notice I was going to the bathroom. She was so engrossed in her novels that she didn't hear me getting up and walking around the house. Victoria laughed. If you'd left the house for a few days, she definitely wouldn't have noticed. The main thing is to put her photo album next to her. Exactly, Eleanor sighed, sitting down at the table. I still can't believe they left me to die. And they believed a hastily concocted diagnosis. They heard I didn't have long to live and started rejoicing. How could they stop to think about the reality of the diagnosis given by Dr. Peter? Victoria and Eleanor began to eat, thinking about what they would do next. I'll live here for a month or two until I figure out how to live on. I have zero plans for the future. For the first time in my life, I have no plans. And what are you going to do here? Victoria asked. An old abandoned house, an overgrown garden, a remote village. You and a place like this are incompatible. If I dive headfirst into it now, I'll definitely fail. It's not the right state, Eleanor explained. You see, I gave up on my dreams of my own business long ago. All the groundwork, the ideas, are gathering dust somewhere in the back corners of the apartment, and I think they're all outdated anyway. I'll live here, clear my head, maybe I'll come up with something. I haven't had a vacation in a long time. Victoria shrugged. She didn't know what to say to her friend. For the first time, she too was at a loss for words. She didn't like David. She didn't even know why. It was foolish of her to refuse to be a witness. However, she didn't think he was capable of such a thing. She had joked about him being willing to sell his own mother. David seemed like a spineless guy to her, incapable of anything but selling insurance. But he was able to abandon a person to die, and not just anyone, but his wife. It seemed like some kind of madness. Victoria spent the first night with her friend in that house and went home the next morning. Eleanor quit her job, but Victoria didn't, and she didn't have a rich inheritance from a grandmother. Eleanor started the new day with a cold shower. Fortunately, her grandmother's house had water and even gas. Her parents had installed all the amenities in the house years ago. But soon after, her grandmother died, never fully able to use them. The cold shower managed to clear her cluttered mind a little, and Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the icy drops of water hit her back. 3 weeks of living in hell were behind her. She had tested her husband. She had hoped to see at least a drop of care or love from him, but in the end, she only received hatred and the expectation of her speedy death. That was the worst of all. Therefore, Eleanor couldn't quickly return to her previous rhythm. Her familiar life was over. She needed to shake herself up. She took out the money she had hidden from her suitcase while no one was looking. The girl went to the shop. She vaguely remembered its location and decided to ask the villagers, as it was early morning, and everyone was either going to work or to their gardens. It was autumn, cool outside, especially in the morning, and Eleanor wrapped herself more snugly in an old coat she found in the closet. She managed to find the shop without asking passers-by. It was exactly the same as it had been 20 years ago. The girl smiled at the sight of the familiar colorful sign and the cloudy window through which she could see the counters and a plump saleswoman in a blue apron. Stepping inside, Eleanor inhaled the familiar smell of fresh bread and lemonade, which the saleswoman loved. The woman's name was Valerie. When Eleanor was little, she was just starting to work there. Now she was probably in charge of the shop. Aunt Valerie, hello, do you recognize me? Eleanor asked. The woman thought for a moment. Something familiar, but I just can't remember. I'm Margaret Miller's granddaughter. I was here as a child. Oh, Ellie, how could I not recognize you? The woman asked, coming out from behind the counter. She hugged Eleanor, kissing her on the cheek. You haven't been here in so long, and nothing has changed for us. I noticed. Will you sell me some groceries? Eleanor asked, looking around the counters. They were filled with food, although the shop seemed very small. The girl checked the prices and realized they were even higher than in the city. The prices are huge, though. Valerie spread her hands. Give me a loaf of black and white bread, a bottle of milk, butter and vegetable oil, a kilogram each of pasta, buckwheat, rice and peas, cheese, sugar, salt, and, oh, Ellie, go to Mrs. Peterson for the dairy. She lives right next door to you. And this milk, the woman nodded towards the counter. It's a shame to give it even to a cat. Its shelf life is 6 months. Where have you ever seen milk last that long? For vegetables, potatoes, onions, beets, carrots, go to Dimitri Thompson. Everything here is from the local farmer, but it's been sitting here for a long time. Almost everyone in the village has their own gardens, and Dimitri Thompson always sells cheaply. Ask for directions. He's not far from the shop. Valerie fell silent. Her words were interrupted by the bell and a man who burst into the shop. He was dressed in dirty clothes. His face was very serious. He pushed Eleanor away from the counter and said loudly, Valerie, give me 2 bottles of mineral water, and someone was supposed to leave an order for you here, a box of medicine and poison for pests. Need to plant for winter soon, nothing to treat with. Nicholas, can't you see there's a customer here? Valerie asked sternly. Nicholas glanced at the girl and waved her off. She's from the city. If she needs it so badly, let her buy it there. I need it urgently. Nicholas! Valerie looked at him sternly. Eleanor raised a hand in a conciliatory gesture. Let him go ahead, Aunt Valerie. He seems to need it more. Valerie, looking displeased, went for the box. Couldn't that have waited just a few minutes? The man was tall, dark-haired. His hands were calloused from work, and his gaze was stern. Eleanor hadn't seen people like that since childhood. Despite his working, slightly untidy appearance, Nicholas was quite handsome and a young man. He was clearly over 30, but definitely not over 40. He looked at the girl, squinting. And is that so important to you? The man asked roughly. I'm not in a hurry, of course, but even in the city people respect queues, and believe me, they're in much more of a hurry there than you are. Eleanor smirked and turned away, feeling the man's piercing brown eyes on her. Valerie came out with a heavy box and handed it to the customer. Take it. The mineral water is over there. She nodded towards the far corner, where mineral water in plastic packaging indeed stood. You'll pay later, right? Nicholas nodded, grabbed 2 bottles of mineral water, and left the shop without saying goodbye. Who was that? Eleanor asked Valerie. The woman waved a hand and went to the shelf with cereals. Local farmer. He inherited a small house and some livestock from his father about 8 years ago. He decided to start a farm, built everything himself, set it up, hired workers, makes do as best he can. He wants to plant fields. But for now, he only works large gardens and sells produce to our shop and in neighboring villages. He's not a bad guy, but a bit rough. No one knows why. Eleanor gathered several bags of groceries and took them home. They were heavy, and she barely made it, but the small refrigerator at home no longer looked so bare. Then the girl went for vegetables and dairy products from the people Valerie had recommended. Although in the city the girl was used to buying everything in the shop, in the village it was cheaper and better to buy from ordinary people. Dimitri Thompson lived indeed not far from the shop. He had a large plot and 2 goats that bleated loudly at the sight of Eleanor. As a child, the girl was afraid of animals, so she avoided them now. In the house, Eleanor found an old man crafting some kind of chair. The girl explained the situation to him and introduced herself. "Ellie, I'm so happy to meet you." The old man smiled through his thick gray beard. "There haven't been young people in the village for so long. You're the first in many years. And Margaret's granddaughter, too. I only remember her daughter, Natalie." "Yes, that's my mother," the girl nodded. "But so, will you sell me some vegetables?" "I can also give you some apples as change," Dimitri Thompson smiled. "Mine are good, ripe, juicy, and they'll store well for winter, and for compotes, jam. Will you take some?" Eleanor smiled happily. However, the smile vanished from her face when she left the old man's house with 3 huge bags that weighed twice as much as the previous ones. Dimitri Thompson had decided to sell her enough produce for a month and a half, apparently thinking the girl would eat only potatoes and beets. Eleanor felt awkward refusing, so she sacrificed her back, which definitely couldn't handle the load. After walking just a couple of steps, Eleanor stopped, placing the heavy bags on the ground. A black car with a large flatbed stopped nearby. "Need help?" Hearing a familiar voice, Eleanor looked up and saw Nicholas, looking at the girl's bags. Remembering the man's words in the shop, the girl began to think. She didn't want to ride with a man who didn't know how to be polite, but she also didn't want to drag the huge bags. So she had to swallow her pride again. Yes, that wouldn't hurt. Nicholas got out of the car and picked up the bags. "You really stocked up. Are you planning to winter here?" "No, making compote, frying potatoes." The girl smirked and picked up a smaller bag, helping to load it into the flatbed. Nicholas turned and took the bag from the girl's hands. Eleanor felt his warm touch and froze for a second. Then she let go of the rough fabric and took a few steps back. Nicholas put the bag down and closed the flatbed. "Show me the way, where to take you." "Of course I will," Eleanor said, getting into the passenger seat. "Someone like you from the city?" "Well, yes," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "And what attracted you here?" "I grew up here," Eleanor shrugged. "And there were problems at home, and I needed somewhere to be alone. I remembered this little house. I always loved this village. It's quiet and peaceful. Nothing interferes with thinking." Yes, that's true. Nicholas drove fast. Either he was in a hurry, or it was just his driving style. However, he wasn't only fast behind the wheel. In the shop or on the street, he didn't linger either, so Eleanor decided it was just his characteristic trait. The bags were unloaded and even carried into the house. Nicholas walked through the grass, which reached his waist. It had already started to dry, so it rustled loudly underfoot. "Is there really no one to mow?" Grandmother did it herself almost until she died. She could do literally everything, from cutting and sewing to mowing and fixing the roof. And I'm just a city softie. Almost no women in the village know how to mow, not even with an electric trimmer. Equality hasn't reached here, Nicholas smirked. "You're from the city, right?" "Yes," the man replied and looked at his watch. "Look at the time. I should be going." "And what's your name?" "Eleanor," the girl introduced herself. "Beautiful name. Nice to meet you, Eleanor." "Nice to meet you too, Nicholas," the girl smiled. Nicholas left, leaving the girl alone. Eleanor watched the departing car for a long time, trying to understand the motives of this man. The next morning began with a clatter and a strange rustling sound. Eleanor, tossing and turning, got up from the creaky bed and went to the window. Outside, in the middle of the overgrown grass, stood Nicholas with an old scythe. The grass was falling in neat rows under Nicholas's movements. It was clear he was sweating, despite the cool morning weather. Eleanor threw open the window and called out to the man. Nicholas looked back, stopping his mowing. He was breathing deeply, looking at the open window, and the girl looking at him. Eleanor was wearing only a long linen dress she found in the closet and decided to use as a nightgown. After cleaning the house and cooking, the girl was quite tired. She had no time left to unpack, so she put on what she found in her grandmother's closet. "What are you doing?" Nicholas raised his eyebrows, silently expressing his opinion of the foolish question. "I understand you're mowing, but why are you doing it at my house?" "Do you want me to stop?" Nicholas asked, looking at the girl with a slight smirk. Eleanor shook her head and closed the window, not wanting to continue the conversation. Besides, she had noticed the man's gaze. He was clearly looking her over. To avoid such situations recurring, the girl changed clothes and went to the small kitchen. Eleanor decided to make pancakes. Of course, she never got up this early and didn't want to cook anything. Moreover, the fast city pace had taught her not to eat breakfast, but she had to feed the unexpected helper who had decided to come to her house early in the morning and work. When Nicholas finished, which was clear from the cessation of the scythe's sound, the pancakes were ready. Eleanor was just finishing frying the last one. The girl went out onto the porch and called out to the helper, "Come in for breakfast." The man shrugged, put down the scythe, and entered the house. He was all sweaty and tired. "You can use the shower." Eleanor nodded towards the bathroom and went into the kitchen. Nicholas didn't take up the hostess's offer. He just washed his face. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. A plate of pancakes and sour cream was in front of him. Eleanor stood beside the table, her arms crossed. "How much do I owe you?" Nicholas raised his eyebrows in a question mark. "Well, you didn't do it for free, did you?" "For the food," the man smirked and took a bite of a pancake. Leaning back in his chair, he looked directly into the girl's eyes, as if wanting to read something in them. "Well, if you don't want payment, I won't insist," Eleanor shrugged. "I'm used to any work being paid for." "Haven't you heard of Help in the Village?" Eleanor snorted and laughed. "You yourself said you're from the city. Aunt Valerie told me you've lived here for 8 years, which means you can't reproach me." "I'm not reproaching you. It's just that city people are always surprised when they're helped for free. I used to be like that too." "Why aren't you eating, by the way?" Nicholas asked, tilting his head. He was looking at the girl with interest. "I don't eat breakfast." The girl waved it off. "I always had to go to work early. I'm not used to it. I usually had a snack at work." "And what did you do for work?" Nicholas asked, tilting his head. "Assistant to the general director of a firm." Nicholas whistled and smiled. "It's surprising that after something like that, you ended up here." He gestured around the small house with worn wallpaper. "Don't think I was raking in money with a shovel, only with a child's scoop. A very child's scoop. But I liked it. I was learning about running a business, and I had a dream. Then I had a stroke," the girl chuckled. "But I'll tell you that story some other time. I need to clean the house and the attic today. Plus, a friend promised to come in the evening. It's a busy life, you know." Nicholas smiled back at her words. "I should be going too, anyway." Nicholas finished his breakfast and left Eleanor's house. She watched him go with a long gaze again, trying to understand this man's motives. Victoria arrived that evening. She brought some things Eleanor had asked for. Victoria whistled when she saw the mown and tidy yard. She put down her bags and called out to her friend, who was currently wiping the cloudy windows. "I need to replace a pane of glass. Where do you think I can find a handyman?" she asked without greeting her. Victoria smirked. "Ask the man who mowed the whole yard for you." "That was Nicholas, the local farmer. He gave me a ride yesterday. I don't think he has time for glass." Eleanor waved it off. "Well, he found time for the grass," Victoria shrugged. "What farmer?" Eleanor stopped polishing the glass. She invited her friend into the house. "If you don't mind, peel the potatoes. They're under the sink. I can't do anything else. I'm tired." Eleanor sank onto a chair and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. Victoria took off her jacket and picked up a knife. "So what about the farmer?" I didn't know him before. He came here 8 years ago. My grandmother died around that time. He runs a farm. He has various animals, gardens. What else is there to say about him?" "Is he rich?" "Vicky," the girl reproached. "What?" Victoria was indignant. "In our time, that's very important. Well, okay. What do you think of him as a man?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "I don't even know. He's somehow ambiguous. First, he was rude to me in the shop, and then he decided giving me a ride was a good idea. And he even came in the morning to mow the grass, even though I didn't ask. And then he refused to take money." "Maybe he likes you?" "Don't be silly," Eleanor waved it off. "He thinks I'm a city idiot as far as I can tell. Take a closer look at him. Maybe for once in your life, you'll have a normal man who knows what being a man means." Eleanor rolled her eyes but said nothing to this. "How's work?" "Oh, don't ask. Without you, our boss has completely gone off the rails. He's already changed his assistant 3 times. He can't do anything. It turns out you did more than we all thought." Eleanor had been living in the village for a month. She had gotten used to the small house and the quiet life, and she had also gotten used to resting, which terribly annoyed her. The girl had worked her whole life. She grew up in a not-so-rich family and started working right after studying. She didn't take days off without special reasons and always came to work on time. And now she had been doing almost nothing for a month. Yes, the first week Eleanor spent on the house, trying to bring it into a livable condition, scrubbing everything clean. But then silence and peace set in. The girl woke up late, read books Victoria brought her, visited the old women, and listened to their stories from their youth. Moreover, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she kept running into Nicholas. On the day Victoria came, he heard their conversation about the glass and came the next morning to replace it. Eleanor fed him fritters. Then he fixed the gate. The girl again made him breakfast. This happened several more times, and it became a habit. Eleanor was no longer surprised by the early clatter outside and the presence of the man under her window, and Nicholas, as usual, would come into the house and sit at the table. There were almost no long and meaningful conversations between them. He didn't give her flowers, didn't pay her compliments. He was just there. He was nearby. It seemed very strange. Eleanor desperately wanted to understand his motives. "Confess, Nicholas, you just come here to eat?" "I didn't say that," the man smirked, looking away from the dripping faucet. Most of their conversations were like this. Short, not very meaningful, and usually playful. Rumors spread in the village, and some girl from the farm even came to Eleanor, threatening her. "Nicholas is mine, understand?" the curvy brunette said menacingly. "Do you think you came here from your city and can snatch up our men? No way." The stranger angrily tore a leaf from a tree and threw it at the startled Eleanor, who was standing on the porch. When Nicholas came the next time, she told him about the admirer. "Were you scared?" The man smirked, but there seemed to be a hint of seriousness in his words. "I haven't been scared by village women yet. I've been threatened by big-grown men when I worked at a large firm. Once, instead of the boss, I refused to sign a contract with a firm, and they almost beat me up right there. 5 grown men in suits, and I was alone. That's scary. Not a leaf thrown by some crazy admirer of a man who, for some reason unknown to me, fixes everything that breaks in my house." Nicholas smiled and fell silent. "You're not very talkative, are you?" The man nodded. Maybe we can switch to you then? The age difference between us isn't that big, is it? Nicholas agreed to the girl's suggestion and returned to his borscht. Eleanor smirked. It was the first time she had met a man who didn't want to talk. One day, Eleanor was walking through the village. Nicholas hadn't come to see her in a while, and she assumed he had gotten tired of it. She went for a walk to clear her head, and somewhere deep down, she hoped she would run into Nicholas on the way. For some reason, she really wanted to see him again. She had gotten so used to his strange silence that she almost missed it. The only thing the girl encountered in the village was men running back and forth. They were talking about something. Eleanor approached Valerie, who had come out of the shop and was looking anxiously into the distance. "Aunt Valerie, what happened?" The woman put her hand to her face. "Well, Nicholas's farm is falling apart. Something's wrong there. Some problems. Our men and women are quite upset. They might lose their jobs. And where else can you find work in our village? Oh, what a disaster. Nicholas always barely stayed afloat, managed as best he could. But now something has gone completely wrong." Eleanor frowned and looked into the distance. "Could you tell me the way to Nicholas's farm?" Valerie explained how to get to Nicholas, to his workplace. His farm was at the very end of the village. It was a large, long building from which the lowing of cows could be heard. Here and there, women in aprons walked around carrying buckets. In the backyard were men. Behind the farm were large cultivated gardens. Now, in mid-autumn, they were empty. Eleanor asked a woman walking by where Nicholas's office was and went there. The man's office was small, even tiny. In the middle stood a desk and a chair. In the corner, a cupboard and a small window in the wall through which crumbs of light entered. Nicholas himself stood in the middle of the office, bent over papers. He was saying something with just his lips, calculating on a calculator, and making corrections to documents. Eleanor approached closer. "Nicholas, hello." The man turned sharply and sighed. "Did something break again?" he asked. "Sorry, now isn't the best time." "No," Eleanor replied. "I heard you have problems. I came to help." "Something with the documents? It's fine. I'll manage," the man said a little roughly, and she stepped closer and almost pushed Nicholas aside, taking the papers. The man exhaled loudly. "Go away, or I'll have to drag you out of here by force." Eleanor raised her hand and looked closely. She only glanced at the papers, but already saw huge sums and exorbitant expenses that, for this small place, compared to the city, were simply unnecessary. "Do you even have an accountant or a finance specialist?" "I manage everything myself," Nicholas repeated. "I can see how you're managing. Exorbitant expenses leading nowhere. You desperately need a specialist." "And where am I supposed to get one?" Nicholas asked glumly. Eleanor smiled broadly and pointed to herself. "I'm an economist by education. Plus, I worked for several years at a firm where the expenses and revenues were clearly much larger than yours." Nicholas waved a hand and tiredly sat down in the chair, leaving Eleanor with the papers. Late in the evening, when it was already dark, Nicholas and Eleanor left his office. The farm was empty. The workers had cleaned everything up and locked up. "Are you sure that if we cut these expenses, nothing will change? Why do you need both cold storage and milk delivery 3 times a day? One is enough. It will be taken away, and it will be stored in the refrigerator the rest of the time. There's no point in driving cars and spending huge amounts of money on it. And it's the same with many expenses. The estimates are very poorly drawn up." Nicholas scratched the back of his head in confusion. "I was a military man, you know. I'm far from estimates, accounting. My father always dreamt of having his own big farm and fields, but I decided to fulfill his dream, even if it's late." "Late? Did he die?" "Thank God, no. He got seriously ill. I had to put him in a special facility. Otherwise, I just wouldn't have been able to cope with him. So I had to raise the farm from its knees. Eleanor looked sympathetically at Nicholas, walking along the narrow path. It was cool outside. The wind was blowing, but at the same time, it felt like it couldn't be better. So calm and quiet. "So what's the story with the stroke?" Nicholas asked unexpectedly. Eleanor flinched. At first she wanted to make a joke, but then she remembered she had promised to tell him. Exhaling loudly, she began her story. "That's when I came up with the plan." She remembered the conversation with the detective. "Eleanor and Vicky helped me carry it out. She found a doctor who, for a small fee, agreed to say I had a stroke and would die soon. They believed it quickly, as if without thinking and expecting it. It was awful. The 3 weeks I lived with my husband and mother-in-law completely erased any pity or sympathy I had for him. I became forgotten and unwanted. And when he brought me here, I knew it was the end." Nicholas took the girl's hand and squeezed it tightly. Eleanor looked at the hand the man was holding in his and nodded in thanks for the support. "Why don't you go back to the city?" "At first I just wanted to calm down and wait a bit, but then I realized I didn't want to go back there. It's such a fast pace, constant rushing. Plus, it's another reminder of Dave and his mother." Nicholas let go of the girl's hand and sped up. "Let's go, I'll show you something." They walked for a long time. Eleanor didn't know where. However, when they arrived, she gasped in surprise. The man had brought her to a huge, luxurious house with a high fence. "This is the house of a friend of mine. We served together. He recently died of cancer. Now the house is for sale. And I don't want it to be sold. I would like to buy it, but as you know, I don't have the money. The house is going to be bought to be demolished and something like a sawmill built here, or I don't even know. You understand that if you buy this house, there will be no turning back? I don't want to go back to the city. For the village, I'm too fast, impatient. For the city, I'm too slow. It's a paradox. Here I can achieve something, but not there." Eleanor's gaze lingered on the man's stern face, on his eyes that looked at the house with hope, on his tightly pressed lips, and on the wrinkles on his forehead that appeared when Nicholas was thinking about something serious. A determined spark lit up in Eleanor's eyes. She squeezed Nicholas's hand, just as he had done a few minutes earlier, and smiled. "You will definitely succeed. I'll help. We'll raise the farm, and you'll become what your father dreamt of. I promise." Nicholas didn't reply again, but the hope that flickered in his eyes made her happy. He believed in the best. Nicholas and Eleanor began working together. She helped him raise the farm, create new working conditions. They bought new livestock and equipment. Profit began to appear not just on paper. The man was very happy about this. He gave the girl flowers several times as a sign of gratitude, and the tradition of fixing Eleanor's house also returned. He would come almost every morning, and she would make breakfast. It was their ritual. A few weeks after the walk, Victoria came to see the girl and brought documents. "Are you sure?" she asked her friend. "More than," Eleanor replied and took the folder. "There's no turning back," Victoria repeated Eleanor's own words. "I know, and I'm willing to take the risk." Victoria remained silent, not wanting to argue with her friend. After what had happened, she tried to support her in all her endeavors. Eleanor pressed the documents to her chest and headed towards the farm. More equipment was due to arrive today, so the girl hurried as much as she could. Besides, she had some happy news. Eleanor found Nicholas in his office as usual. He was sitting at his desk, writing something. At the sight of the girl, he smiled and brightened up. "You're early," he said, pulling out a chair for Eleanor. The girl sat down at the desk and placed the papers on it. "Read this." Nicholas took the folder and slowly began to turn the pages. With each page, his eyes grew wider and wider. The girl watched his reaction with hidden fear and anticipation. Closing the folder, Nicholas put it on the desk and lowered his eyes to the girl. "What have you done?" he asked hoarsely. "Did you buy the house?" Eleanor nodded and tiredly got up from the chair. She stood directly opposite the man, tilting her head back and looking him straight in the eyes. "You didn't want it to be demolished. It was your friend's house, and I promised you would succeed." "That's a lot of money," Nicholas breathed out. "It's my money. I can do whatever I want with it. Besides, I like the village and—" Eleanor's stream of thoughts was interrupted by a kiss. "Is this how you decided to get the house?" Eleanor smirked when Nicholas pulled away. "Is that what you think of me?" he asked hoarsely. "No," the girl breathed out. "I bought this house for us, if you want us to be together. I think I've fallen in love." The man kissed the girl again. "Me too," he replied, gently hugging Eleanor. "The present." David sat opposite his wife and couldn't believe her story. His hands lay limply on his lap, and his eyes stared straight ahead. He wasn't trying to see anything. He simply couldn't turn his head in surprise. "You mean you made all this up to test me?" Eleanor looked at him sadly and sipped her tea. There was a knock at the door. Victoria entered, wearing a tight blue dress. She looked directly at David and smirked. "Well, did you tell him everything? Too bad I couldn't see his face. I'm a little late." "So you knew everything?" David roared. Victoria smirked. "That was my doctor, whom I paid for the diagnosis. Did you really think Ellie pulled all this off alone? She loved you too much to do that. But you broke her heart. You decided you could treat her like garbage." David pursed his lips. "You don't know anything. Ellie, I love you. Ellie." Eleanor raised her eyebrows, smirking. "And Lily? Is she no longer suitable for you? Or couldn't she wait for you to open your business and shower her with gifts?" David opened his mouth to object, but fell silent at the last moment, realizing that excuses were pointless. "But how dare you play such a trick on me and Mother?" David asked. "She was so upset when she found out you were sick." Victoria and Eleanor exchanged glances and laughed. Patricia Smith was running ahead of everyone, shouting with joy that her daughter-in-law was sick and would soon kick the bucket. "She was waiting for my inheritance more than you were." David looked around the house, then smiled broadly. "Did you buy and earn all this while married to me?" Victoria frowned, understanding what her friend's husband was getting at. She wanted to object, but he opened his mouth again. "And since you acquired this while married to me, half of the property is mine, right?" Victoria was a lawyer. She knew the law perfectly well and how such situations ended. Eleanor stood up from the armchair and looked at her husband with anger, wanting to tell him everything she thought about him. But at that moment, the door opened, and the same man from the car that had cut off David entered. "Hi, Nick." Victoria nodded and whispered something in the man's ear. He turned to David with a very serious, enraged face. It seemed almost impossible to stop him. He advanced on the man. David swallowed in fear and began to back away. "Get out! If you idiot, decide to threaten Ellie, I'll make your life hell," Nicholas said roughly, grabbed David by the scruff of his neck, and threw him out of the room. Victoria, Eleanor, and Nicholas heard the front door slam shut. David was walking away from the house quickly. "Why did you let him in?" Nicholas asked Eleanor, coming closer and hugging her from behind. In front of her husband, she had held herself together, not wanting to show weakness. but everyone in the room knew how hard she had taken her husband's betrayal. The girl stood with her head bowed low, holding back the urge to cry. "I had to tell him everything," the girl said. "I needed to see his face when he realized my inheritance wasn't coming to him." "Did that make you feel better?" Victoria asked. Eleanor nodded and wrapped herself more tightly in Nicholas's strong, reliable embrace. "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow." Despite Nicholas's threats, David decided to file a lawsuit for divorce with property division. From a legal standpoint, everything was correct. If he had claimed the inheritance, he would have been wrong. But the girl had bought the house and leased the fields, the income from which was considered jointly acquired property. The court summons arrived by mail. Nicholas brought it with the other documents and handed it to the girl grimly. When Eleanor opened the envelope and read the summons, she turned pale in an instant and sank tiredly onto the sofa. She was all dirty and dusty, having just returned from the fields, but she didn't care. She hadn't thought David would actually file a lawsuit for property division. However, she had also thought he wouldn't abandon her to die. He turned out to be a very unpredictable person. "We need a good lawyer," Nicholas said, taking the summons. "Vicky," Eleanor said. "She heads the legal department at the firm. She has a license to handle cases. I think she can help us. Plus, we don't need to tell her our story." Nicholas sat down next to the girl. "Listen, I looked in the bathroom after you yesterday, and..." Eleanor looked at the man in fright. "I don't know what to say, and I found a test there. Are you pregnant?" Eleanor nodded. "I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd be against it, and..." A soft kiss interrupted the girl. She hugged the man and smiled broadly. "So you're not against it?" The joyful smile, the man's mischievous eyes, gave a better answer than any words. He hugged the girl tightly and held her close. "If that scoundrel suddenly decides to sue you for half the property, I don't care. You and I won't be left with nothing. We'll have our house, the fields, our child, and each other. We'll have each other." Eleanor closed her eyes and took a deep breath. But when she opened them, Nicholas saw the look that had once frightened the detective. It was a determined and unwavering gaze. "He went to court to take what belongs to me by blood, but he will leave there with nothing. I will take not only what's mine but everything he has. He will be left with nothing." The trial took place very soon, as if the universe itself wanted to finish this strange case quickly. Victoria became Eleanor's lawyer. Nicholas supported the girl from the witness stand, as did many villagers. The judge was a tall, red-haired woman with a stern gaze. She listened to the plaintiff David's statement with boredom, asking clarifying questions that he couldn't always answer. It seemed to amuse her. The plaintiff's witnesses included Patricia Smith, neighbors, and David's friends. They all said only bad things about the girl. Patricia Smith spoke at length, as if for the last time, putting on her full dramatic performance. "I was so scared when Ellie, and when she had the stroke. I didn't sleep for 3 nights, waiting for news from the hospital." Tears streamed from the woman's eyes. She wiped them with a white handkerchief and continued, "And when I saw Ellie, I almost had a heart attack myself. She didn't move. She was almost lifeless. I had to look after her while Davy worked. I cleaned up after her, fed her, and she wasn't sick after all. The worst thing I could ever experience has already happened to me. My son and I were betrayed, deceived, and now they want to leave us with nothing." Patricia Smith cried again and sat back down on the bench. After her speech, the judge seemed to become more invested in the case and listened to the other witnesses with interest. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's and his witnesses' words should not be trusted. To begin with, the defendant has evidence of the plaintiff's infidelity. The recording is attached to the case." The recording of Lily and David's conversation boomed throughout the courtroom. Then the detective testified as a witness, talking about the plaintiff's relationships. Lies! Patricia Smith jumped up from the bench, but after a warning from the judge, she sat back down. She seemed deeply upset by the slander. Furthermore, I would like to note that the defendant did not deceive the plaintiff documentation-wise. She merely pretended to be sick to test him. No medical certificates were provided. The doctor only verbally gave the patient's diagnosis to the plaintiff and his mother. Also, the plaintiff's side claims they cared for the sick defendant, Victoria continued. However, I have a recording of a conversation between Patricia Smith and her son. Please play it. Yes, Davy. Feed her. Oh, I got so caught up in reading, I completely forgot. But it's all right. She can wait until lunch. She won't lose any weight. How are you doing? Did you find a caretaker for her? Good. The main thing is she charges little, and the fact that she drinks, it's not a big deal. The doctor said she wouldn't last long anyway. The recording stopped, and the courtroom gasped in surprise. Victoria continued. Furthermore, the plaintiff has filed a request for the division of the following property: a residential house at the address Ilyanskaya Village, Rapina Street, House 8, as well as income from the fields of the Golden Birch firm, which were indeed purchased by Eleanor Smith, the defendant. But this property was transferred to the full ownership of Nicholas Peterson a week before the lawsuit was filed. Consequently, the property was acquired during the marriage and also given away during the marriage. Therefore, the plaintiff cannot demand its division. The remaining money in the defendant's personal account and the share in the estate in Germany are part of the inheritance, which the plaintiff also has no right to claim. The judge smirked. She did it almost imperceptibly, but Eleanor could have sworn she looked at David with a hint of joy. To transfer the property to Nicholas's ownership, they had to work hard and find a corrupt notary who would backdate the transaction. This greatly helped the case. Well then, in this way the claim is considered invalid? The judge asked Victoria. The claim by David Smith is aimed at an equal division of property between the former spouses. But this includes not only the defendant's property, but also the plaintiff's own property, namely, a 3-room apartment at Pegasova Street, House 24, third entrance, Apartment 33, a BMW car, as well as the money in the joint account of the plaintiff and the defendant. I object! The plaintiff's lawyer, a portly old man with a bald head and round glasses, jumped up from his seat. The apartment is the plaintiff's inheritance from his father, correct? Correct, Victoria nodded. But by law, if one spouse has made significant changes to the property of the other spouse, it can be recognized as joint property. And what significant changes were made? The lawyer asked. Now on the screen, Your Honor, you will see photos of the apartment before its renovation. As you can see, it was in decent condition. This was exactly 1 year after the wedding, and here are photos of the apartment after the renovation, 6 months later. How will you prove that this was done with the defendant's money? Firstly, during the period from September to April, when the renovation took place, the plaintiff was not working, and according to the bank statement, there was not the necessary amount of money in his personal account. Furthermore, the testimony of the foreman of the renovation team is attached to the case. The contract was concluded in the defendant's name. The lawyers argued for a long time, calling witnesses and trying to prove their point of view. But soon the judge withdrew to deliver the verdict. She returned with a large red folder. All rise, court is in session, the judge's assistant said. The court ruled to satisfy the plaintiff's claim. David Smith's property will be divided between him and his wife. 1/3 of the apartment goes to the defendant, the car becomes jointly owned, and 50% of the money from the plaintiff's account becomes the property of Eleanor Smith. The court's decision is rendered and is not subject to appeal. The bang of the gavel settled everything. David and Patricia Smith glared with malice and hatred at Eleanor, whom Nicholas was hugging. Victoria, smiling broadly, joined them. "I told you we'd take everything from him," the girl said in a slightly strange, almost possessed voice. "It's rightfully yours, not his," Nicholas breathed out. "Understand? Now you and I have everything we dreamt of," the man smiled. "All that's left is to have a child, and the house will be full," Victoria said, gathering her papers. "Well?" Eleanor prompted and looked at her stomach. Victoria smiled. "Quick work, certainly. Will you make me the godparent?" "Do we have a choice?" Nicholas asked. "None at all." Eleanor smiled and hugged the two most precious people in her life again. Now, she was sure, everything would be all right.